So hello and good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us on this Spotlight webinar. We have joining us this evening Professor Prof.Goh. He holds the appointments of Directors of Industry Research at the Logistics Institute Asia Pacific, a joint venture with Georgia Tech, USA, and he's Principal Researcher at the Center for Transportation Research. He also used to be the Director of Supply Chain Solutions for Asia, Middle East with APL Logistics, crafting logistic engineering solutions for major MNCs. He's also the Professor of Management at the University of South Australia. Amongst his previous professional appointments, he's also been a board member of the Chartered Institute of Transport, member of the Advisory Committee of the Transportation Center, and the past Vice President of the Operations Research Society of Singapore. He was also a member of the Global Advisory Council on Logistics and Supply Chain with the World Economic Forum. Thank you, Professor Goh, for joining us this evening. We are really happy and excited to hear you talk. You truly are an expert in this domain. So, maybe as a starting off point, maybe it would be good if you could give us an introduction to the supply chain area, and also what trends you were seeing in this space, predominantly in the Southeast Asia territory, before this unfortunate pandemic hit us all and we all went into lockdown.
Okay, I mean, that's a very good question that you raised. It's Chennai, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a very good question, but it's a long question. I was really hoping for a shorter question, but I'll try and give a succinct answer to that. First, supply chain is interesting because, as you know, it's been reversed for many, many years since time immemorial. Second, of course, is that the term supply chain has been coined only quite recently. Recently means about 20 years or so ago. Previously, of course, we call it either transport, distribution, logistics, and so on. But it's anything to do with gluing the things that we have in business together, and that's what the supply chain is all about. So in that sense, the first thing we recognize is that the supply chain is a glue, right? And it's an important glue, right? Two, supply chain is not a product in itself, it's a service. It services manufacturing, it services other industries, be it food, be it pharmaceutical, be it end of life, be it even waste, right? So supply chain is a service. Third, of course, is that supply chain is very complex. The problem is that as you go beyond the country, beyond the village, beyond the region or the province, the complexity doesn't increase linearly. It actually increases exponentially because, for a simple reason, there's the politics that's involved, as we saw in the supply chain issues between China and the US. And because of that, now it has created another set of supply chain issues between China and Australia, where now China is throwing a lot of tariffs on the Australian supply market. And so what that means is that it will disturb the flow of goods into China and services provided by Australia. Now, in terms of what is the challenge that we see in for supply chain management today, I'm sure all the supply chain professionals will let you know, and that is that it's always a day of firefighting, because there will be endless, ceaseless issues that will crop up any time of the day, anywhere in place and time, right? And in any location. It can be simple problems like, for example, at a port, customs has not cleared the goods, hence there's a delay. And because it's a delay, someone has to press the panic button and say, how do we get the goods into the factory on time? Why? Why on time is simply because we all have been predicated on the notion of just in time, saying that it helps to keep inventory low. But trying to keep inventory low means that you cannot afford delays anywhere in the support or in the transport line. So what does it say? It says that everything must be done with clockwork. But we all know the reality of it is this, that with clockwork, that any system that works on that basis becomes very fragile, very brittle, because any disturbance will cause a stoppage. And that's exactly what happened in this current pandemic as we see, right? Because many industries have actually done three things, for good or for bad. First one, of course, is outsourcing, which is a supply chain issue altogether. And because of outsourcing, right, you find that now companies do not keep unnecessary safety stock. They do not even know where their stock is coming from beyond the first level of suppliers, right? Because they have divested that responsibility to their outsourced partners. So what does it say? It says that I've got no visibility. So when there's a break in the supply line, straight away I panic. And that's exactly what happens in the has happened in the current pandemic, where you find that the simplest of shortages, for example, like face masks, like your personal protection equipment for the healthcare workers, right? They all went missing, went short because everybody was grabbing for it, and hence you find that it created a whole herd mentality at the retail store, at the supermarkets, and even in the hospitals. And of course, what's the net result? You find that companies panic, they react, they respond, either rationally or irrationally. Governments panic and respond accordingly because there is a need to fulfill an unmet demand. That again is a supply chain issue because it's about marrying supply with demand or matching demand with supply. And what have governments done? Well, I think one of the things they've done is they started to look at the issue of outsourcing, started to look at the issue of globalization and say, do we really think globalization is good? Or to revisit the whole issue on the drawing board again and say, can we not regionalize instead? Maybe we can protect ourselves from the frailties of the whole global supply chain. The other part, of course, is can we not revisit the whole issue of nationalization of industry, right? And that's what we've done in some of these countries where they've started to nationalize and say, we need to have a company that is able to produce face masks for the whole country. And a good example, of course, is, I won't say direct nationalization, but soft nationalization. And that's where in America, for example, you see this, that the car makers like the GM and so on, they've been making face masks. Even breweries have been making all those sanitizing solution, right? So those are all examples of a complete reversal in our drive to have a tip-top supply chain, so to speak. Now, the other part, of course, we have to recognize is that the pandemic that is with us today, yes, it's a big problem. A scale that perhaps we have not seen. In Southeast Asia, for example, the largest scale that, if I recall correctly, where we had such issues was actually the tsunami, where we see a lot of challenges in the supply chain. That was in 2004. Then another one was the Fukushima incident in 2011, where companies were affected, in particular, electronics and automotives. But this pandemic has apparently hit more than what we like, right? It cut across several sectors, several industries. Consumer goods is one of them. Food is a particular situation. Medication, even the simple things that we talked about just now, the face masks and the PPEs, those are all examples where the global supply chain is heavily at work and we need good supply chain response. Now, of course, moving forward, if you look at this pandemic, is it new? My short answer is no, because why? 100 years ago or so, 1918, 1919, there was a Spanish flu, right? The good news is that it was 100 years ago. And we were not so-called recipients of that. Otherwise, you and I won't be sitting in this room to have this discussion or this conversation, if you like. The bad news is that I think we have not learned much from that now, because people died. Now, the saving grace, of course, is that in that pandemic in 1918 and 1919, it was estimated that 20 to 50 million people actually succumbed to that pandemic. Now, of course, in today's context, we don't have such a bad case. We only have about 5 million people who are affected by that COVID-19 situation. But that's bad enough. Bad enough in the sense that it has affected the smooth running of the supply chain. Right? I'll give you an example. What do you mean by smooth running of supply chain? Today, you see airlines. India perhaps is a bit more responsive getting your situation off the ground, but in places like Singapore and other places like Thailand, the common lament is that they've cut down capacity severely. I mean, because when we say severely, we don't just refer to 10, 20%. In the case of Singapore Airlines, I mean, I did a recent interview with another media, broadcasting media, and as part of the interview, I had to do some background work. And I found, lo and behold, in the case of Singapore Airlines, they actually cut their capacity by over 90%. Now, what does that mean? It means that it's a very simple numbers game. If I have 200 planes, if I cut, say, 96%, or it means I only have 4 planes out in the air running. So I only got 8 planes running, literally. So what does that say? It says that, look, where have the planes gone? That's the first thing. Then if you're running a business, then you'll be concerned because you will ask yourself, right, where have the customers gone? Right? How am I going to get revenue? And most of these planes are not bought with cash alone. Usually, they're bought on credit, they're hired out or leased out in that sense. So there is an issue of cash flow. But how do we then resurrect the cash flow so that business can continue? And that's where we find practically every country in the world now is looking at government bailout of their supply chains, be it in transport, be it in services and so on, they need governments to come in to help them because we have never worked on that unprecedented scale before. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that in terms of development, technology 100 years ago is very different than technology today. 100 years ago, we don't have the internet. At least I can say that with date certainty, but today we have the internet, right? And luckily we have the internet. So that's why I think the numbers that have fallen to COVID-19 are a lot less. And the way we have now positioned our supply chain to manage the risk and for better resilience is a lot better because we have smarter technology to guide our thinking, data, faster data to inform our policies and our actions, and more importantly, the hindsight of knowledge, right? Whereby we know that there are certain areas that we should not go in, or it's not the right time, or how do we then close off certain clusters? And a good example is, of course, labor workforce. As we all know, COVID affects people, and people are important in the supply chain industry, in the logistics industry. Without people in the warehouse, without people involved in the transportation, then nothing moves at all, right? So that's where we have duty and responsibility to safeguard the workers of this industry. And that's something that I think governments around the world have been doing a good job, trying to quarantine them to make sure that they are well. And hence the numbers have been kept at a basic, or if possible, below that minimum that we want to see before we say that we are COVID-free. Of course, that does not solve the problem. We still have problems that will come with this pandemic in the supply chain context. One of which is that we've built a lot of ships, not just air now, because air predominantly is for people to travel and some time-sensitive cargo, but for ships which carry the bulk of the global maritime trade in that context for the global supply chain. Because the demand has dropped, all of a sudden you find that the ships are also not well utilized. Right? So what does it say? It says that, look, we have to fill up the ships. And why are the ships not utilized? Because of the COVID, we have the circuit breakers, people have to stay at home, or what we call the movement control orders that are in place. Basically, it says that a few other industries will be affected, one of which is retail. Right? Let's go back to the retail and the facilities in the supply chain framework. My guess is that with this new COVID situation, the new normal will be there will be fewer people shopping, going to their shopping centers with their retail therapy. So what that says is this, that those shops with retail will have to look at other ways of selling their products. So what that means is maybe more online. Now, if you look at the demographics of the people, right? The older folks are more used to buying on a touch and feel basis, but the younger folks are more internet savvy. So what does it say? It says that maybe it's time for us to rethink the supply chain and say the bigger focus is on making it more digital, more resilient. Of course, resilient would mean that it's not just subject to all these pandemics that are coming our way, but more importantly, digitally resilient. In short, cyber security. That's something that we have not seen yet, right? But it will come, right? Because there will be a lot of smart folks outside there and say, hey, how can we break into the system and test the security of the system? So I think if you look at all this that are happening, we put them into the pot and look at how can we manage the supply chain better. Well, I would say we are living in challenging times. We need new norms and we need to understand so-called the invisible enemy that we are facing.
Okay, thank you. And so, like what you were talking about, people shopping more online. So, I mean, there's currently an exponential growth with e-commerce as well. But do you think this is more of a short-term trend that as soon as once things settle down, it'll stop? Or you think it's just once people get accustomed to it, they won't shift back?
Okay, that's a very good question. If I recall correctly, I had a few discussions with this in terms of the mall operators and so on, right? And I find that the trend towards online, at least in Asia, in this part of the world, is growing, surprisingly. And the mall operators have a challenge. What is the challenge? They say that we see the goods coming in, but we are not selling enough through our facilities. And even in places like Australia, there are established names. I mean, as in names that are brought up through the generations, well-known Australian household names. They started to close down. And the first thing they will close is your brick and mortar stores. And the first part of the brick and mortar store closure strategy is move away from the expensive shopping malls because they claim the rental is too high, expensive for them to maintain. And they cannot justify the footfall, right? But having said that, it does not mean that their online business has gone down. On the contrary, it's either remain stable or increase because they are an established brand. So the people who know their brand and they are accustomed to shopping online, more internet savvy, they'll be more acceptable to buying things online because they enjoy the convenience. Now, where's the flip side? The flip side is this. You enjoy the convenience, but you still need people to do the delivery, the last mile, so to speak. Now, where's the issue then? If people are affected by COVID, then where do you find people to do the last mile, right? So hence the problem again in the supply chain. So we can have the best technology, but the execution, as in the final stage execution of that technology, remains to be improved. And that's something that we have to really seriously think about. Right? And I think in all situations, whether it's in Latin America, where I heard a comment by Don Radcliffe last week in another webinar that we had through the University of Hull in England, right? He says the same thing about what's happening in Latin America. There's a lot more people doing things online, shopping online, and of course, playing with the fingers and rather than accessing with their legs to go and visit the malls to see the shops, right? But truth be told, demand is still there. The question is, how do we respond? Now, the other issue, of course, is that because the search in online buying has gone up, you find that the cost of the last mile transportation has gone up. Second is that deliveries are getting longer because they cannot meet with this new demand. Right? So the whole business process, the whole business model of online shopping maybe, right, has to be relooked in sync and in line with the supply chain.
Okay, so that's something that's, so is that something people are looking at towards the last mile delivery?
That's right, they are, definitely so.
Okay.
And of course, here we talk about last mile. We can many last miles, as in last mile for food, last mile for retail, and so on. And I'll tell you this, the last mile for food, as in food that's taken off from Grab and so on, or even Flipkart if you have that in India, right? You find that that has gone up tremendously. Yeah. Stores are becoming smarter and say that, hey, I have a physical presence, but I also want to make use of my online presence, means the O2O concept, right? To be able to push my goods through, because I cannot afford to have to pay for all the hardcore facilities and yet not using my kitchen or my raw materials that still continue to come in, right? So that's something that you just have to manage the whole supply chain. Now, the good news is, of course, there will be beneficiaries, because as long as there's demand, the supply chain will exist, right? In the food supply chain, for instance, demand for food will always be there. Now, the question then is, okay, where will the supply come from? And hence, if we organize it correctly, if we know where the potential supply points are and secure places for food supply, then we will have a stable supply chain again, because then that will require the lines of transport to come in, the aeroplanes and the ships. Give an example. Again, let's go to Southeast Asia, and I'll bring in our nearest neighbor in Southeast Asia, which is Australia. SIA just had a recent report this morning or so saying that, look, the supply lines of food from Australia has increased by 500 tons a week. Right? So what does that mean? It means that from a virtual low number to something which is significant, 500 tons. Right? So that will use a lot more planes that they actually originally intended. Now, what's the good news? The good news is that we are re-establishing the gateways for the food supply chain into Southeast Asia.
Okay. So do you think this whole situation will change the way current inventory models work?
Definitely, definitely. I think one of the things that it will change, remember I mentioned about this thing called just in time and the fragility or the reality of the supply chain, and we said it's being very brittle. I think just in time, nothing wrong with that, right? I think it works on the premise that the whole supply chain, the people the actors, so to speak, in the supply chain, they're all well disciplined, that we know each other. We have trust in the system, that we make sure that if one piece is consumed, another piece will be there for replenishment. But in today's context, the consumption is not rational. Right? Remember the case of the toilet paper that happened about 4 or 5 weeks ago, right? I frankly, up to now, it's just over my head. I cannot understand why is it that there's a big run on toilet paper, right? Common, essential commodity, no doubt, but it's never seen a big sharp increase of, say, double, triple the demand. It's a stable commodity. It's a functional product, if you like to put it that way, right? But there was a big surge in demand for that, and hence supermarkets were running out of toilet paper. It was a frenzy for it. So what does it say? It says that basically the concept of manufacturers or producers making toilet paper on a just-in-time basis has to be rethought. Maybe we should not go for just-in-time. We should go for a just-in-case situation. The second aspect to this is, I think why there's a big demand surge and why there's a lapse in terms of replenishment is because we have lost sight of the visibility. The visibility in this case is of the supply side, and not the visibility of the first level suppliers, but the supplier of the supplier. So that's maybe something that we need to build into a system to make it more resilient, so that even if we want to adhere to a JIT approach for the physical operations, we must at least have a visibility of 2 levels up in our supply chain, so that at least we know whether we can react comfortably or whether we need to then go and source from another further away location, albeit at a slightly higher cost.
Okay. And so do you see any dilution within lean inventory holding concept with manufacturers seeking comfort in holding large inventories then?
Well, I mean, in this day and age, the COVID situation, those who held large inventories like thermometers, like PPEs and face masks, we all benefited, isn't it? Right, to the point that it almost brought up an informal economy where people can say, now we can make reusable face masks from the clothes that we have. But of course, you know, there's face masks and there's face masks, right? So that's something that I think humanity, okay, if you put it this way, humankind, we are creative as humans, right? So when there is a demand, when there's a need, someone will come and fill the void. The market is efficient, but the question is, have we actually solved the problem in the right way? Have we solved the problem in an effective way? Right? Because until unless we have solved the problem in the right way and an effective way, you find that the supply chain will still not be as ship as before.
Okay. And will you see an increased usage of the vendor managed inventory model as well?
Okay, for VMI, I think it's been there, it's been in place, well instituted, but VMI also is predicated on the concept of making sure that the supplier is responsible. But if the supplier, in the context of a supply chain, has no visibility of his supplier's supplier, then he also cannot oblige that, right? So, and the other part, of course, of the equation is this: if the supplier is offered, in terms of compensation, a monetary compensation of something which is much higher than what is being offered by the current buyer, naturally, I think, right, sometimes it's worth the effort while to break the contract and switch to a market that's more willing to pay the premium for the products that are needed. But I'm not saying that VMI is bad. I'm not saying that VMI will die. But what I'm saying is that maybe some of these concepts will have to be rethought through. Right? For example, whether it makes sense to have a truly global supply chain to put everything into one shop or one production plant, or whether you should look at now a localized supply chain. It's a bit back to the same old issue where in Europe talk about backshoring and so on, because they found out that outsourcing on a global basis basically meant that they were forced to shed their workforce. But by doing backshoring the right way, they found that, hey, the workers are properly employed, well employed, and more importantly, because you do backshoring, you keep the technology at home, right? So you can actually understand how the technology is being worked, and then it gives you better incentive to improve to the next generation of technology that's needed, right? So those are pros and cons. As to whether there's a right formula, I guess a magic answer, what you're asking for, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that. But I guess it's very much touch and feel. It's very much driven by the industry you're in, and pretty much driven by the supply and demand situation.
Okay. And so, given for logistic companies, because now they're cutting back and they're rethinking their entire model, do you think, for them, would there be any greater demand for them to provide value-added services like pick and pack, light assembly?
Definitely. If you talk about assembly, it's more manufacturing based, but the pick and pack, definitely. And I think here, maybe we need to do smarter pick and pack, right, to customize to the demand of a specific location. For example, in a hospital with COVID, maybe the pick and pack could be looking at more wipes to be used on in the facilities on the patient and the touch points in the hospital, which are high risk for contamination, for example, right? So in your pick and pack, then you must, instead of packing one set of tissues or whatever, or one set of face masks, maybe you want to also build in contingency, right? So that's where we talk about, putting in the extra effort to understand, for example, the supply chain analytics and say, what is the real demand like at the micro level, so that when you pick and pack in a smart way, catered to a certain environment. Now, what do you mean by catered to a certain environment? Pick and pack in a larger hospital where there's a large incidence of, say, COVID patients, right? Obviously, your pick and pack must be focused on putting in the right sort of disposables or consumables for those patients who need it. Whereas you do the pick and pack for a simple community hospital where the COVID victims are actually convalescing, right? Maybe you want to scale down on some of those components, right, or the items in the pick and pack so that it can be directed to better use elsewhere.
Okay. Okay, and then even for warehouses that there's a big we see lots of talk going on redesigning of the warehouses to cater to all your 3PL operators. Like, do you see a lot of like a big demand happening because everybody's saying all our warehouses they need to be redesigned, they need to have IoT, robotics, automation. So are you going to see a massive surge in that as well happening?
Okay, that's a very good point, but I'm not going to just refer to warehouses alone and specifically, because when you mentioned the thing like IoT and robotics, this current pandemic actually gave the whole world, the whole industry, a little gentle push. And sometimes we need that push to push us in the right direction to do. For example, there are two things in the supply chain that is predominantly traditional. One is that we always say the supply chain needs people. And without people, it's hard to move supply chain. That's the first thing. The second thing we always say is this: if we are a developing country, why do I need to embrace technology when the labor is cheaper relatively, right? Now, you look at what COVID has done. Because of the lockdown, because of the circuit breakers, because of the movement control orders, you find that workers are not allowed to go to the points of their work unless they're considered as an essential activity or essential service. And not many of these warehouses will be considered essential. I'll give you an example. Warehouses for retail, clothing. Yeah. Probably in India it's the same thing. You probably realize this, and that is that most people have not been to a retail point to buy clothes. Most of them will be more concerned about their food, right? Their safety. And most of them will not venture out to go and buy clothes and shoes and so on. But does that mean that the warehouses don't operate? Well, it does. Warehouses must still operate if there's a demand. So, but if you do not have the workers going into a warehouse to operate, then how can you make sure that the warehouse is functioning? That's where robotics, IoT will come in, right? Because then you're doing, with IoT, for example, smarter replenishment. You don't do a push model down to the retail store, but you push it on the basis of demand, actual demand that's created, and then you push it to the right pickup point, to the last mile delivery person. It can be the bicycle, it can be the motorcycle, it can be a delivery van, right? And then they will take care of the local distribution within the local neighborhood, for example, right? That's a very simple example. The other one has to do with this other form of technology, which is the digital format. All of a sudden, with the COVID-19 situation, you find that people are not allowed, fewer people are allowed to go into the office because of social distancing. So what does that mean? It means that now we must find smarter ways of working. For example, the way I'm communicating with you now, right, is through the internet. But that is only possible if the internet is well designed, well managed, right, and well utilized. That's where we have a real challenge, because you find that even now with 4G technology, that what we have in most parts of the world here, right, you find that there are also peak periods where we all can tell that the internet is significantly slower. Why? Because a lot of us are going online to have our conference calls, to have our meetings on a virtual basis rather than a face-to-face basis. But because of this COVID, I can rest assured, and I'm sure you can too, and that is that new technology like 5G technology will come into place, where 5G is very useful for IoT operations, so that whatever information is disseminated through one device, then all other devices in a small neighborhood can probably see it. So what that means is this, that now response time as far as information flow is concerned will be much, much faster, hopefully more accurate, and hopefully more reliable, as in not being tampered with or broken into or hacked into by other people outside the system. Now, but does it solve the overall supply chain problem? Unfortunately, no, because at the end of the day, it's still the last mile execution. So that's where the smart thinking must come in. Maybe it's time for other forms of technology. And that's where you mentioned the word robotics just now. So let me come back to that and talk about robotics. Maybe for delivery, because of the lack of workforce to do delivery or labor to do delivery, maybe the robotics will come in a real way to say, hey, maybe you should use smarter laser-guided robots or satellite-guided robots to do the final mile delivery for reasons of ensuring consistency of supply line, for reasons of safety of the workforce involved, especially, for example, give a simple example, delivery of food to COVID patients in a hospital, which is a safer option. Getting a nurse or a porter to deliver and getting the nurse to risk his or her health in the process of delivery versus getting a robot in, which is being scheduled, programmed to deliver on time, every time, right? And coming back to be self-sanitized, right? So that's where I think technology in these various forms will help to express the supply chain to the next level of maturity.
Okay. And do you also see like a big demand happening for tracking of cargo from the point it leaves the manufacturing unit until it ends up with the customer, like full tagging, so you can digitally follow the exact movement of the cargo, so people have all the data?
Well, that's a very good point. We talk about tagging, I've been through a few generations of tagging already, from handwriting tagging to barcoding to laser tagging, if you like, and then to RF tagging, and then finally RFID. But these are all tags, right? But what we need is something to ensure that whatever we transmit across is assured, is tamper-proof, if you like, data, right? And also, it conforms to the specifications. What do you mean by conforming to specification? I'll give you an example. India is probably going to experience it in the next 3 weeks or so to a month. Why? Because your summer is coming. So what does that mean? If summer is coming, you still need food that are chilled, for example, vegetables even, right? It might not be chilled up down to 0 degrees, but even chilled to say 15 degrees so they can preserve the life of the vegetable. Otherwise, the brinjal, for example, you deliver from States to from Chhattisgarh to Delhi. By the time they reach Delhi in the height of summer, they're all spoiled, right? So what does that mean? It means that how do I make sure that whatever I deliver, it will reach its final destination, and how do I make sure that along the way there's no so-called damage, no theft, no willful manipulation of the data and the products? In short, how do I ensure data integrity, right? So that's what tagging is supposed to do, isn't it? Right, to provide that kind of visibility and at the same time to ensure data integrity. Today, the good news again, we have this new concept that's been floating around for quite a while already, and that is called blockchain, right? Maybe in this current situation whereby things are a bit slower, people still want to know and yet have assurance that whatever they send across, both in terms of physical and information flow, it is integral, it is protected, and it is safe. So that's where I think the next level of technology to come into place will be the blockchain technology, so that every stakeholder will say, I don't have to worry too much. I can now focus on what we need to do to look at the final execution. And at the same time, I know that whatever I send out, it is safe, whether it's a public blockchain or a private blockchain. So everything is assured. So if you look at this, we are not saying that the supply chain has moved totally from a physical operation. The physical part, the heart of the supply chain must still be physical because you still have to deliver to where demand wants it. But what I'm saying is that the other aspects of the supply chain, the digital aspect, the architecture, the informational aspect, perhaps that will need to be rethought through.
Okay. And so what did, at the start when China attracted all the manufacturers to invest into establishing the manufacturing facilities there, what do they offer to the supply chain to attract this big boost in their manufacturing?
No, that's a very tough question. I guess you're asking that question from the perspective of an Indian and say, what must the regional governments do? And I think the regional governments in India have been doing exactly that and doing very well. I was involved in some of these things. Like, for example, there's a place called Pondicherry, right, where it's supposed to be a hub. Right? And you look at this, what did the Indian government do? They said, first thing, okay, no tax, free trade zone, right, for all these parts. Why? Because you want to attract manufacturers. Manufacturers, for a start, producers are a start. They're driven by two things. One, the market, whether there's a real demand for the products they are making, so that they want to be close to market so they can be responsive and customized to the taste of the local market. Two, we want to look at the cost relationship, right? So it's about customer and cost. Look at the cost relationship and say, how can I lower the cost? How can I make it cheap and still sell at a better price and then increase my revenue so that I can grow the business, right? So cost-wise, in the case of China, they were fortunate. And likewise for India now, you're fortunate because cost is relative, isn't it? Right? While you're cheap now, yes, your cost will go up, but what is preventing the overseas manufacturers from getting out of the country, as in becoming footloose and going to another location to produce, which is what happened in the 1980s for the footwear, textile, and clothing industry. Remember the FTC industry, where there was a Harvard Business article written by Markidis and Berg talking about reshoring and offshoring and so on, right? And they took a very well documented case about the clothing industry, footwear industry, where they showed how they have moved from places like Taiwan to Singapore, then from there to Malaysia to Thailand, and finally to Vietnam. Right? And you look at it, the main driver for all this was actually cost. Why? Because it's expensive to make labor, and as the labor cost goes up, okay, then you find that they have to justify their reason for staying or for living or for operating in that country of concern. For China, of course, they recognize this. First, when they started, it was cost. Then after that, it's not just cost, because there's the other C to consider, which is the competency of their workforce. And if you look at China carefully today, they don't just have the low-cost industries. In fact, a lot of the higher-cost industries, let's say electronics from Taiwan, from other places, if you go down to southern China, there's a place called Shenzhen and so on, where there's a big hub, right? In the middle of the Pearl River Delta, there's a big hub of manufacturing electronics and all that. And they've been there for the last 10, 15 years. Now, why is it so? Because, well, cost is not as cheap compared to some of the other places that we see in Southeast Asia, but it's relative. But in terms of their skilled manpower, in terms of, say, design of IC chips, they've got a big ecosystem down there. They've got a critical mass down there. So what does that mean? If you think about it, in a free market economy with critical mass, it also drives down some of the labor costs. And then it brings up better innovation or innovative ideas, right? Because people are creative, and that's the fourth C. So back to India. What must you do to make sure that you are ahead in the supply chain game? So that's where you have to think in a more creative way, right? And I think in the case of the free trade zones that I've seen in places like Chennai, I think you're very creative. You created a lot of this because you recognize that you need a gateway to open. You need to provide the kind of facility, the kind of infrastructures that people are familiar with, right? So that becomes a node for your transport corridor. And hopefully with the transport corridor set up, you also create a trade corridor. And through the trade corridor, it will then engender economic growth, not just to Chennai, but also to its hinterland, because it's important that you grow the hinterland. Otherwise, there's a massive disparity, right? And with massive disparity, we all know there'll be a big social divide, and then after that, unrest will kick in again, right? So that's important. Now, how do we create the kind of competency? And that's, again, something that we have to focus on, and that is on education. Educating people in a smarter way. Technology education, STEM-based education, as in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, I think will have to stay. It must stay, and every undergraduate must be taught at least one of these main pillars so that they can then relate to the new world. I'll give an example. What does it mean by relating to the new world? The supply chain of today, the folks who are working in supply chain are very different from 30, 40 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, if you've got the muscle, you've got the relationship, yes, it's good enough to move things. It's good enough to run the business, run the supply chain. But today, you have to be more tech savvy, because a lot of it is systems driven. Systems driven in the sense that you see what is happening on the screen, you take action, you take data informed action based on what you see on the screen. And then you know how to calibrate your decisions better. Previously in the past, it's just, because of experience and gut feel, you say, this is going to happen, I will take it. But today, we've got all of these, unknown events that are happening. So you really cannot tell. But if you do machine learning right, if you have sufficient data to guide your thinking, to guide your decision, of course, with machine learning, as we all know, it's not 100%. There will be a certain level of prediction accuracy, but that's good enough to guide our thinking, and then we can use our brain to plan for the other, say 15 or 16 or 20% or so, right? So that's where I think training of the resources that are needed to drive the next wave of supply chain management development is important.
Yeah, that's true. So I think something we have to also focus on is developing a skilled workforce as well to be able to deal with this level of manufacturing. So, I
Yeah.
mean, there's even for moving out of China, like this right now, there's such an increased sentiment, especially in India. We see it all over our media about manufacturers looking at moving out of China. So, when we see,
But you be careful here, Chani. The moving out of China is not because they're moving out of cost. It's because there's also the other part which we have not covered, and that is the external factor, which is the trading blocks, the discussion between China and the US. And so some
okay,
companies are getting the jitters and say, I cannot afford, right, to have a break in the supply line. So what do? They move out, no doubt, but they don't move very far. For example, let's look at electronics again between China and Vietnam. Some of them have moved out from China, but they are actually plonked into China's neighbor called Vietnam, right, where they do a lot of the, like you said, mentioned correctly just now, not the design part, but the assembly and testing.
okay. So just the light, so it's just the assembly. So they're not taking the co-manufacturing out. Then it's just the assembly
Because you
part.
still move out, it's not so simple as in just one factory moving out, because when you move out, you have to consider the whole ecosystem, and the ecosystem involves not just production, not just assembly and testing, but also the components and also the design part of the electronics, right? So those are important ingredients. So the question then is, as you move up into the value chain, you got to rethink your supply chain and say, what parts of the supply chain must you have? What modes of transport you must you have? Whether you're going to be reliant predominantly on shipping, or you are happy to stay with air transportation and say you pay a premium, but you get it in a faster time, because the clock speed of ocean transport versus the clock speed of air transport is different. One is in hours, the other is in days or weeks.
Yeah, it's true. And how do you think Vietnam, so is Vietnam gaining from all this? So is Vietnam getting like a big influx of manufacturers setting up?
To some extent, yes, for those who are familiar with Vietnam. But the thing, of course, is the training level, the so-called capability level. That's what we talk about, right? Capability is another C that we can bring into this conversation today. The capability level of the Vietnamese, you ask a question, are they really good for production? Are they really cheap? And second is that, are they really good in terms of design, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not just the capability in production that you need, but also the capability in terms of design. Say, hey, this is what the customer wants today, but you could think beyond that and say, what do we think the customer really wants tomorrow, so that you can design a better product, a smarter product, and a cheaper product for them.
Okay, okay. So I think one of the biggest takeaways is that if you have to shift to manufacturing, even if you just have to shift the assembly part, you still need to work on your skilled workforce and also have a good
Yeah,
design, yeah,
correct.
part of
Correct.
it
Yeah.
as well.
Because at the end of the day, we don't want just to be a sweatshop, right? We
Yeah,
want to be
yeah.
a smart shop, whereby, we don't just produce, for what the mass market is doing, but we want to produce the right product so that we can preempt ourselves for the future. I'll give you an example. You talk about China just now, and I'm always amazed, when I see these companies like the telecommunications, handphones. We have never thought about handphones being made in China as being good, right? As being, top of the line. We always thought it's cheap stuff, and it's true. When I saw my first handphone, and I experienced that in China, I tell you, the name was strange. Didn't strike a good note about it. Second is that the product looks a bit tacky. But today, you look at China, these products like Huawei, for example, handphones like Oppo, which I'm sure in India you use a lot of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? And you think about it, it's not even a distant 10, as in number 10 in the whole market for handphones, but it's at least a number 3 or number 4 in the Indian market in terms of market share, right? Now, how is that so? Because when China went to the handphone market, they did a bad job. They were using one of the old, what do you call that? Old generation handphones. Then after they say, okay, mass manufacturing handphone for the Chinese market, fine, we can do that. Then they encourage foreign manufacturers. For example, Motorola, which has got a plant in Tianjin, northeast China part. They've got Samsung, they've got old days Nokia and so on coming in. And then even Apple, right? And iPhones, right? They've got it in southern China. Then they came in. Then guess what happened? The Chinese learned. Maybe some of it is not legal, maybe unethical, a bit gray, if you like. But they learn through reverse engineering. Then they look at it and say, okay, these are some parts that they've done, but how can I do it better? Now, doing it better means what? It's not to produce better. You can produce better by cutting costs, by increasing the workforce, by building more factories. But doing it better means what? Making it a sleeker design. right? Slicker design, smarter operating system, right? That's what Huawei did, right? And then say, okay, let's sell it to the market that we think will appreciate this product. And they did. And today, guess what has happened? Huawei is no more the last kid in the block, the new kid in the block. They're established, they're big, and they're well established, right? To a point whereby there was one point, if I recall it correctly, Samsung said they will not produce any more handphones in China. They moved out because they were like a paltry third or fourth, right? They were beaten by Huawei. So what does it say? It says that if you plan it correctly, and if your supply chain moves along with what you're thinking in terms of your business model, based on your business canvas, then I think you're always one step ahead of the competition. And then that will ensure your survival.
It's quite an interesting analogy. Thank you. So I think at this point, maybe we could take some questions as well from some of our participants. I think some have already sent in 2 questions.
Sure.
We've got one from Mr. Balchan. He would like to know, I think you covered this.
If you can, maybe, sorry, I have to
Sorry?
butt in this way.
Yeah.
If you could, maybe
would technologies like use of drones, a combination of secure cloud-based technology solutions, and the introduction of AI gain popularity?
Okay, I was going to make a small request, and that is that if you could, perhaps just put in where they come from, which industry, because again, some of these technologies that we talk about could be very industry specific and industry dependent.
Okay.
Okay, let's go back to the first one. His name is Balaji. Is it? Did I get it correct? Sorry.
Mr. Balchand.
Balchan. Okay, so his question is about drones and so on. Actually, I've got nothing against drone. The only thing I have against drone is that I think they're too expensive, right?
Yeah.
Too pricey. Because if they were cheap, say $50, $100, you know what? I would have bought one 3 years ago and tried. But of course, you know, if you use a drone for recreational purpose, it's very different from using a drone for commercial purpose. Okay, recreational, that means I can fly in my house, and I'll be very happy to fly in my house because I can then see things which I cannot see. Say, for example, if I live in a house, I want to see whether there's a leak in the roof. I have to check it physically. I have to climb up, and then I risk myself danger of falling off, slipping, and so on. But if I have a drone, if I know to control it well, the drone has eyes, as in cameras attached to it. So what does it say? It says that I can fly the right height, that it can see for me. So the drone becomes my eye, right? It becomes my eye. It can communicate back to a monitor, which I have close by to me, and I can see what's happening. I can take remedial action. So what does it say? It says that there is a place, there's a purpose for drones. And likewise, in the supply chain stage, there's a place for drones. Why? Because in a warehouse, for example, you mentioned, I can have many security guards to look after my goods in the warehouse, or I can have a drone to move around the warehouse on a well-coordinated basis, or a series of drones, right, to move so that every blind spot is covered. Why do I say blind spot? Because in every warehouse, to the best of any design, there will always be some potential blind spots that security cameras cannot capture, that people cannot be sitting there 100% of the time, that we have to rely on something else called faith or hope that it will not happen. But that's where drones will come in. For example, there was a recent warehouse explosion in Singapore, 2-story warehouse. It was so bad that even the walls gave way. So you can imagine how intense the fire was now. Yeah. Imagine what would happen if there were actually drones, you know, patrolling the warehouse at night and giving the alarm. The alarm might not be just security camera footages. It could also be temperature footages, as in temperature sensors attached to the drone. And then the drone can pick it up and then communicate to a so-called control center or a security point or a police station or a data management center. They say, oh, the temperature in this warehouse is now too high. Straight away, action can be taken. So that's where we think we can use the technology for good and for smarter purposes. So I think with drones, there's a need and there's a value for them. That's one. Two is that if you're in the game of logistics and you're thinking about drones, I tell you, any experienced old hand in logistics or supply chain will tell you, right? I can use drones. Why? Because if I'm going to deliver goods to a remote area, if it's going to be online, we talked about online just now, right? Look, I can send a truck to a village, right? From its point where it's been either retrieved from customs or from the port, and the point could be 200 kilometers, Right? Now you tell me, what's the cost of transportation? And I can tell you this, it's not going to be cheaper than the cost of transportation within a city itself, right? Because the unit cost of transportation within the city for that product will be much less than to deliver or to send it over a distance of 100 or so kilometers. There will be a cost factor. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that if your demand is small, as in only one unit, guess what? The delivery provider will say, okay, if you're not going to pay much, you're going to pay only a vanilla cost, as in standard costing. I'll tell you this, don't expect a delivery the next day, right? Even though it's 300 kilometers. At best, I can do for you is a week later. So what does it say? It says that you're challenged by time, right? Because you got to suffer from the tyranny of distance, right? But if you have smarter ways, of course, I'm not saying that drones can do it today. If you have smarter ways and say that I can do a drone delivery, assuming that the drone can cover that distance, which currently today the technology cannot allow that because it probably has a service radius of 5 to 8 kilometers and a payload about the same amount, right? But if I can do that in a smart way and say I can do a drone delivery, or maybe you and I as a consumer of the package can say, I have a drone, I can send my drone to pick it up. Why not, right? So that's where you have to challenge our mindset and say, think of the impossible. But of course, if you talk to the regulators, they'll tell you, no, you can't do it. Why? Because you need to be approved. You need to comply, right? And drones, if you think about it, Airbus, I had a discussion with Airbus a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, in fact. They were looking at drones. And you'd be surprised, Airbus is not just an aeroplane company. They also do a lot of other interesting things, right? And they were saying that, look, how can we do drone delivery in a big city? Why? Because I'll tell you this, the challenges of last mile transportation in the big city, especially where it's high rise, is not the movement on the ground alone, as in the XY coordinates. It's also the Z coordinate or Z coordinate, because you have to move up many floors to do a personal delivery. So they were looking at saying, how do I deliver? And then, deliver to the top of the roof using a drone and then leave it down there and someone can pick it up. So you save time. You save the delivery man's time so that you can then improve the productivity of what we call his rounds or his beat. Right? So that's something that I think drones have a place in. The other part, of course, is remote areas that we talk about, delivery of medication. I think it was Desha who did it in Europe. They tested it, and it worked a lot better because you can deliver necessary, useful, life-saving medication to those who are living in isolated places like islands. As you know, in Europe, in Northern Europe at least, a lot of people like to live in quieter places. They like isolated islands. But of course, when you get older, isolation can also mean the demand for prompt health services.
Yes. So we've got another question. This person is anonymous. How do we expect warehousing to change in the coming months and years in terms of infrastructure? Is automation and robotics going to be feasible in countries with cheap labor? So I think this is quite relevant in our Indian market.
Yeah. Okay, fine. We can try and answer that. But actually, I would prefer you to make known to me, so at least I know where you come from, then I can better answer your questions. Warehousing and so on, automation. This is a question that was asked of me about 5 years ago when this thing called 3D printing came about. The big issue that was posed to me was, with 3D printing, will we see a need for finished goods warehouses, or will there be a demand for raw material warehouses? Because as you know, finished goods warehouses and raw material warehouses, the nature of their operations and security could be quite different, right? With 3D printing, I think if it takes off well, it has taken off to some extent, but it's still small in scale, right? And there are many things that can be 3D printed. And in the construction industry, for example, sharing of blueprints and all that, a lot of it can be done, through computers, and they can print out some test models, if you like, or what we call I can't remember the exact technical term for it, but they can actually 3D print their models and show. And in the medical sector, for example, your shoulder joints, your prosthetics and all that, look, you don't have to wait 2 months for, say, a prosthetic joint from Germany to come to India or to Singapore, right? If you can 3D print and you got the resins in place, hey, they can do it in a matter of 2 weeks, right? So that cuts down the lead time tremendously. But what does that mean? It means that you still need physical raw materials. Traditionally, you need the finished goods, right? The actual prosthetic joint. But now you need the raw materials, the resins and so on, to be available so when you need it. So what does that mean? It means that how do you store them? So that's where then we ask the question, do we go for a large mega warehouse to store all these raw materials, or do we look at smaller warehouses along the way, the service warehouses where we can then deliver? Now, how do we address this problem? I think the answer there lies in the analytics of it, the data of it, say where is the demand historically, how should we preempt, and then you look at the consumer profile or the population profile and say who needs this final product more than other people, and what are the components that come into these final products, so that then if I have a need for 3D printing, how should I ship it in the best possible way and in what amounts?
This question was from, he hit anonymous by mistake. It was from Mr. Anirudh Kemka. His background is in last mile logistics.
Excellent, excellent. I love to talk to people like that because that's a real challenge. Last mile in a so-called flat city, if you like, is very different from last mile in a built-up city like Singapore and Hong Kong or even Tokyo. Anyway, what was his question?
I think you just answered it on the warehousing development.
Okay.
So we've got another question from Mr. Swadeep Patnaik. He would like to know, is China going to be world factory, or if every other country has the potential to take over that position? I think you covered this.
Yes. China is no doubt a world factory, but truth be told, China is not just a net exporter. In fact, if anything, China is also a net importer because they import a lot of things into it. But the question is, what do they import in? Is it the raw materials, the intermediate goods, or the finished goods? In the past, about a few years ago, 10 years ago, a lot of it was actually finished goods, especially on the consumer side, because as you know, the younger generation of Chinese living in China is a bit different from the previous generation. They like to embrace brand names, icons. So they think that goods that are from overseas are better. That's the first thing. Second thing is that even though it's a brand name with a local presence in China, they still would rather buy a brand name item which is made overseas. Okay, so again, it's a quality perception thing. Okay, so we have to change the mindset. Like what the Japanese did in the 80s about their cars, isn't it? Toyota, for example. But even today, right, you find that people will still think that a Toyota made in Japan is better than a Toyota made in India or in Indonesia or in Thailand. Okay, so same thing. You have to somehow change that mindset to say that once it's quality, it's actually quality consistent, quality uniform.
So we've got another question from Mr. Weber Mittal. He's from Mahindra World City. He wants to know, do you think there's going to be a big demand, any demand for built-to-suit warehouses, built-to-suit options?
Customized
warehouses.
Correct. Customized, I think there will be a demand, right? For example, in terms of online, right? We went through a couple of them. One was in China, and one was a Japanese one. I tell you, a lot of these warehouses, they are big for online, but I think even online goods, they're online products and they're online products, right? So you got to be able to customize that. But the danger for all this online, and I'm sure if you've worked in the warehousing business, you know, the returns for all these online products is not a low percentage. It's as high as 20 to 30%. So what does that mean? It means that if you're going to the online game, you need to have your warehouse structured in a slightly different way. A small portion for storage, a larger portion for all the work area or the staging area, if you like, and then even larger portion for the return merchandise, right? Because these are the rejects that come in that you need to have another place in the warehouse to so-called recondition this stuff and then qualify them as being fit for use, so to speak, right? If you use a quality terminology. So what does it say? It says that, back to the earlier question that was asked about the size of the warehousing, I think if you look at the way I've described the warehouse of the future, if you embrace online commerce, then you find that the warehouse configuration must modify, both in terms of how you want to shape it, and then also in terms of the zoning of the warehouse and allocation of space for the different activities that are involved in the industry that you want to target, right? Whether it's retail, whether it's in food, for example, right? Food, of course, the danger is a question, not danger, but question is this: do we throw the food away if it's rejected by the consumer, as in the supermarkets? And of course, you know, regulation has that you can't just simply throw, right? Because you've got to get rid of it in a socially conscious way.
So we've got another question. This person is also anonymous. The shipping lines seem to benefit from the pandemic as they have been collecting huge detention charges in a situation where during this pandemic. How can we restructure this for the future in case of, again, any future?
Okay, I can see that the person who asked the question is a shipping guy, his experience. I've also dealt with this issue of detention, demurrage before in my past life. And I tell you, these are all organized because why? there is, okay, I hate to use that word, but I think and I believe so, there's a cartel out there in the shipping industry who determine all these charges and rates, and they will agree upon. And every time you think about this, whenever there's such events that we've seen recently, the pandemics, shipping lines can be either be very happy or very sad because for a simple reason, right? Shipping rates along expensive shipping lanes are very competitive, so they don't get a lot of revenue from that, right? It's quite cutthroat. So what do? Right? If the demand shoots up, then all of a sudden everybody is happy because they say, oh, now there's demand, I can charge a premium and hence I can benefit. So what does that mean by I can benefit? It means not just the cargo rates, but also the port dues and charges, right? So all this will have a flow factor in them. So that's where this pandemic has helped some of these players. But the question is, how long will the good times last? Because whenever companies have to pay extra, I tell you this, the shippers are not going to sit there waiting for pain to come. They will say, I got to stop the hemorrhaging. I got to find internally what's the best way to stop, right? So they're also, in a sense, being very proactive to say, okay, what can I do? What should I be doing so that I don't have to pay for the excessive charges? Because at the end of the day, every company works on a budget. So if this is the case, then if no one's going to pay through, or if the demolish charges happens, what some companies do is say, oh, I'll tell the customer, fine, this is the rates. Then after that, you charge me as a carrier, I'll tell you, I'll pass through the cost to the customer. And the customer accepts, well and fine, nobody's going to complain, right? But if the customer doesn't accept, then guess what? They have to look at their own business model and say, hey, I've got to cut my operations in a smarter way. That's all.
Yeah, it's true. So we got one more question from Mr. Anuj.
I'm sorry, young lady. I think my time is up, isn't it?
Oh, yes, it is.
Yes.
So,
I'll take the last question.
Okay, we have one last question from Mr. Anuj. How do we find the balance between resiliency in supply chain and lean supply chain?
That's a great question. It's a trade-off between agility and leanness, right? Of course, the thought leaders in this in England especially, they came out with this phrase about 15 years ago where they say lean plus agile is the new norm. Of course, they use a nice term called lean-agile, but we all know the reality between lean and agile is that if you want to have both at the same time, you can't be engaging in a seesaw, right? Because no one can move, right? So somehow it must give way. Okay. First is internally, I think every company should be lean, but customer facing, every company should be seen as agile.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Goh. I think this was a very insightful session. We have more questions, but I will send it to you on an email. And if you have time, you could respond back and we'd get back. So thank you so much, Professor Goh, for such an insightful session.
Pleasure. Hope you have
we have lots of takeaway points from here, especially for all of us looking at new business opportunities. I'm sure all our participants have found it very interesting and useful as well. The recording of the session will be up.
And I thank the participants too for their patience in listening to me for the last 60 minutes or so.
I think it was very interesting. You clearly held their interest because they've all stayed on as well. So thank you. I think it's a very relevant topic right now, isn't it? So we're all being affected by it. So
yes, certainly. Yeah. So stay safe, okay? I'll see you guys then. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Goh, and thank you to all our participants. The recording of this webinar will be on our YouTube channel, Circen Technologies. And just as an introduction, you probably have seen the name Chennai Free Trade Zone on our flyers. This is a free trade zone located on the Chennai-Bangalore highway. We currently have major 3PL companies operating out of this facility. And you can get more information on this on our website, chennaitz.com. We are also in the planning stage for our next phase of development with planned infrastructure for plug-and-play manufacturing facilities, high-tech manufacturing, and also new warehouse buildings. So if you'd like to know more or even want to have a chat on this, please do reach out on the email address that you have of mine. So until then, thank you all for joining. I hope you all enjoyed this session. See you all soon. And until then, please, all of you, be well, stay safe, and keep washing your hands. Bye-bye.